Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to my channel Sleepy History. Before we begin tonight's story, please tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I love seeing sleepy souls from all around the world. And hey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a little comment, even emoji, to let me know you're here. Now, let your body relax. Lie down on your bed. Turn off the lights. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in, and gently let it out. Let go of the day. Let go of all thoughts. Just be here with me in this quiet moment. And as we begin tonight's journey into history, let your mind drift. Let your body rest. And slowly, gently, fall asleep with the story. The fires had long since faded. The banners that once fluttered over Marcus Aurelius's legions were folded and forgotten. But his name, his memory, did not vanish with the wind. In the heart of Rome, among marble columns and sun-warmed statues, there lingers a presence. It's not loud, it doesn't boast, but it endures a quiet echo of wisdom, carried in stone, ink, and time. Children play beneath his statue in the Capitoline Hill, unaware of the weight in those eyes carved from marble. Scholars pass by, heads bowed, perhaps thinking of meditations, those solemn pages whispered across the centuries. Tourists snap photos. Pigeons rest on bronze. The world moves on, yet Marcus remains. For he was never merely an emperor. He was something rarer, a ruler who wrestled with his own soul, who did not mask doubt, but studied it, who saw pain not as punishment, but as a teacher. In life, he was called the Philosopher King. In death, he became something softer, a guide for the weary. The empire he left behind would falter, stumble, and bleed. Yet, even in decline, his presence shimmered like gold dust on forgotten stone. His thoughts, humble, honest, unfinished, would outlive every palace. Somewhere in a quiet library, a young reader turns the page. Somewhere in a silent study, an old man closes the book, eyes misted. And somewhere deep in the past, Marcus, cloaked in wool, walking alone through a foggy battlefield, keeps going. One foot in front of the other. Not to conquer, not to rule, but simply to understand. In the soft glow of Roman twilight, young Marcus grew not in opulence, but in quiet dignity. The halls of his family's home echoed not with laughter of spoiling, but with the rhythm of discipline, the kind that shaped both mind and spirit. His parents, though noble, raised him with modesty. His grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus, a 3-time consul and deeply respected senator, had instilled in the household a sense of public duty and personal virtue. Marcus watched him closely, absorbing the way he walked, spoke, and paused before answering weighty matters. He was still just a child when Emperor Hadrian took an interest in him. It was a strange sort of attention, quiet, but powerful. Hadrian saw something in Marcus, something calm and weighty beyond his years. The boy had a stillness about him, a kind of natural wisdom. While other children scrambled for favor or sweets, Marcus sat beneath olive trees, tracing the grains of marble columns with his fingers, pondering the world in silence. His tutors noticed it too. One by one, they commented on his unusual temperament. Diognetus, the philosopher, gave him books that other boys would have found dry: Epictetus, Cleanthes, Zeno. But Marcus read them not as duty, but as nourishment. He copied their words by hand. He whispered them to himself at night. They became, in time, the scaffolding of his soul. He wore the Greek cloak, the pallium, as a boy, not the Roman toga. It was a sign of philosophy, not politics. Even Hadrian jokingly called him Verissimus, the truest of the true. He was not yet 10, but already whispered of in court as someone strange and special. In these early years, Marcus came to believe in 2 things: that life was short and that virtue was its only true purpose. The world around him, filled with ambition, noise, and wealth, could not compete with the quiet clarity of thought. It was not escapism. It was a kind of gentle resistance, a choice to live thoughtfully, deliberately, even as the empire itself swelled with unrest. And so, in the silence of his youth, Marcus Aurelius began to grow not toward power, but toward something rarer, inner peace. The death of his father came like a whisper, quiet, sudden, and complete. Marcus was only 3, too young to understand, but old enough to remember the weight of the silence that followed. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, did not wail. She stood still, a statue carved from restraint. She raised her son in that same silence, teaching him not to chase joy, but to cultivate character. Even as a boy, Marcus learned that loss was not an interruption to life, it was life. And from it, he began to harvest patience. He watched the seasons pass in his family's gardens. He noted how flowers bloomed and died and returned again. Everything moved in cycles. He began to suspect that perhaps people did too. He didn't run through the streets like other boys. He wandered them. He walked slowly, often alone, touching the stones of the Forum with reverence. There was something in him that already belonged to time itself, not to his peers or even his present. His thoughts were not of toys or praise, but of fate. He wrote, even then, little phrases in the wax tablets given to him for study. To accept, to endure, to become. By the time he turned 12, Rome itself began to watch him. His name was whispered in the same breath as Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, a man of even temper and noble heart. Some believed Marcus might someday rise beside him. Others thought the boy too strange, too thoughtful, but Marcus, in truth, never cared for such whispers. He listened only to the quiet voice inside him, the one that asked him to be good, not powerful. At night, he studied by lamplight, scrolls spread across his small wooden table. He read the Stoics like bedtime stories, their pages crinkled with use. Outside, Rome roared with noise, the cries of merchants, the clatter of soldiers, the laughter of noble sons. But inside Marcus's room, there was only the flicker of flame, the breath of parchment, and the birth of something vast and invisible, a mind becoming steady as stone. They called him Verisimos, the truest one. Long before the crown, long before he became emperor, Marcus was simply a boy with a quiet fire in his chest, the kind of fire that warmed rather than burned. At age 12, he began wearing a philosopher's cloak, a thick, simple garment that swept the floor as he walked. The other boys laughed, but Marcus did not laugh back. He looked at them with calm eyes and said nothing. To him, this life was not a performance, it was a preparation. Every morning, before the sun could rise over the hills of Rome, Marcus would wake to study. Greek, Latin, rhetoric, geometry, ethics. The world flowed into him like water into stone. His tutors were the finest minds of the empire. Diognetus taught him to love simplicity. Junius Rusticus gave him the gift of Stoic texts, and with them, the courage to endure. Apollonius, the philosopher, taught him patience in the face of chaos. And Sextus of Chaeronea showed him how to live with dignity, without ever demanding it from others. But it was not just what they taught, it was how they lived. Marcus studied not only their words, but their silences, their posture, the way they responded to insult, or illness, or time. And quietly, piece by piece, he shaped himself into something rarer than power. He shaped himself into peace. He wrote notes to himself daily, not to boast, not to publish, but to become. "You are not disturbed by events," he once wrote, "but by your judgment of them." He was only 15. Rome rumbled around him, a beast of gold, politics, passion, and blood. But Marcus walked through it all like a monk in an empire of noise. He didn't seek fame, but fate was already watching. He was still a child when Emperor Hadrian noticed him. Not for his sword, but for his silence. Marcus didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't beg for attention like the other noble boys. He listened, he reflected. And in a palace drowning in ambition, that made him shine like the moon in a sky full of fire. Hadrian watched him closely. He asked his advisors, "Who is that boy? the one who looks like he's already forgotten this world. They told him, Marcus Annius Verus. Hadrian smiled, and perhaps even whispered to fate, then let him remember Rome. He arranged something few expected, for Marcus to one day rule. Not alone, but as part of a plan. First, Lucius Verus would rule beside him, brothers by name, mirrors by contrast. And so the education of Marcus Aurelius became the foundation of an empire. His afternoons were filled with lessons not only in philosophy, but in law, politics, debate, the Senate's workings, the art of command, the weight of justice. But even as teachers sharpened his mind, Marcus kept a soft place for the world. He wrote down reminders to himself. Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about others. It is not how long you live, but how well. While others memorized power, Marcus studied mortality. He was not afraid to lose. He only feared not understanding why. And when night fell, and Rome's golden lamps flickered across the Tiber, he would sit in silence and write, lines meant only for his future self, thoughts that would one day be read for centuries. But he didn't know that yet. He was still just a boy, learning how to carry the empire without letting it crush him. In the quiet corners of his study, Marcus began writing what no one had asked for, a dialogue with himself. Other boys his age boasted of future glories. Marcus, he whispered questions to the universe. What is virtue? What is pain? Why must a good man still suffer? He was barely 16 when he began reading Epictetus, the freed slave turned philosopher. The Stoics taught that life owed us nothing, and that peace was found not in power, but in the taming of one's soul. The universe is change, he scribbled. Life is opinion. To the palace guards, he was a soft-spoken noble in a purple cloak. But inside, Marcus Aurelius was already wrestling with the weight of life. He was preparing not for the throne, but for the storm. One mentor, Junius Rusticus, saw what the boy was becoming. He did not flatter him. He taught him truth sharp and unsoftened. Rusticus gave him Epictetus' discourses, told him not to chase applause, warned him of the seductive lies of court flattery. And Marcus, unlike so many others in Rome, listened. He practiced waking before sunrise. He trained his body, not to impress, but to discipline. He studied legal cases, histories, and languages not to dominate, but to understand. In the marble silence of Rome's finest schools, a strange thing was happening. A philosopher was forming inside a prince. And while emperors before him had feared death or conspiracy, Marcus began fearing something rarer: the loss of his own clarity. He promised himself, if I ever hold power, I will not be its prisoner. He would fail, sometimes. He would suffer, deeply. But the boy was becoming something the empire had not seen before. A thinker, a warrior, a ruler who wanted nothing more than to live rightly, and to sleep with a quiet heart. In the quiet rhythm of Roman life, amid politics and philosophy, there bloomed something tender in Marcus Aurelius, a longing not for power, but for connection. He had seen too many unions built on strategy, too many cold alliances sealed with wine and silence. But Marcus, he believed in affection, he believed in warmth. And one day, that warmth had a name: Faustina the Younger. She was no stranger to the empire. Daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius, she had been raised in the marble shadows of the palace. But unlike many noble daughters, Faustina was not quiet. She laughed loudly. She teased, she challenged. And Marcus, he smiled. Where he was contemplative, she was bold. Where he hesitated, she leapt. They were opposites, yes, but not adversaries. Together, they became a balance, the philosopher and the fire. Their wedding was not just a political arrangement, though it pleased the Senate. It was something rarer, a true Roman love. In private letters, Marcus called her my most faithful companion. In public, she stood beside him not as a symbol, but as a partner. They would have many children, 13 in total, and though fate would take many of them young, Marcus wrote often of the joy their laughter brought. He found solace in fatherhood. In the chaos of ruling and reflection, It was the soft grip of a child's hand that reminded him what mattered. "When you rise in the morning," he would later write, "think of what a precious privilege it is to breathe, to think, to love." But love in the palace was never without whispers. Faustina, strong-willed and often independent, stirred rumors of affairs, of travels without permission. And though history would judge her harshly, Marcus never did. He defended her, trusted her, even when others did not. And when she died far from Rome, in the East he mourned not as an emperor, but as a man who had lost half of his soul. He named her a goddess, built temples in her name, and in the long silence that followed, he wrote more: to understand grief, to hold on, to love even when it vanishes. Love, in the Roman Empire, was rarely soft. It was often a transaction, a calculation, but between Marcus Aurelius and Faustina, it became something else. They were not strangers forced into vows, but minds that met across marble halls, hearts that grew beside columns and scrolls. Their letters, what little remain, are not grand speeches, but quiet reflections. Marcus wrote not as an emperor, but as a man in awe of his wife's spirit. And she, though bound by duty, moved freely, visiting distant provinces, speaking with generals, aiding the poor. Faustina did not stay cloistered in Rome. She rode with Marcus during the Marcomannic Wars, crossing rugged lands few empresses dared travel. At night, beside fires lit on foreign soil, they spoke not just of battles, but of Rome's soul, of their children, of dreams after war. And yet, Rome whispered. Senators murmured that Faustina was unfaithful, that she charmed too many, traveled too far without permission. But Marcus, he never condemned her. He chose trust over gossip, loyalty over fear. In his meditations, never once did he accuse. Instead, he thanked the gods for giving me such a wife, obedient, loving, and simple. Love, to Marcus, was not about control. It was about grace and forgiveness, about seeing someone fully and still choosing them. Their life was not without tragedy. Many of their children died young. The palace often echoed with silence instead of laughter. But still, they hoped, and still, they tried. Their surviving son, Commodus, would one day wear the purple robe of Rome, a boy of blood and fire, but that story comes later. For now, in these years, Marcus and Faustina loved as few rulers did. Not as icons, but as husband and wife, through joy, through grief. And when her time came, when her breath faded in the highlands of Cappadocia, Marcus wept, not before crowds, not in the Senate, but alone. And later, he built a town in her honor, Faustinopolis, where the wind still carries her name through the ruins. As the years passed, Marcus Aurelius and Faustina aged not in splendor, but in weariness. The weight of empire was heavy, and love, even love, begins to shift beneath such burden. They no longer walked gardens hand in hand, too many affairs of state, too many funerals, too many scars. Yet still, she stood beside him as cities burned, as uprisings stirred, as barbarians pressed Rome's borders. In public, she was called Augusta. In private, he still called her my soul's anchor. Faustina bore 13 children. Only a few lived past infancy. Each loss carved silence into their home. But they never hardened. They endured. She traveled more than any empress before her, not for pleasure, but duty, to calm provinces, to lift morale, to touch the forgotten with the hand of Rome. And it was far from home in the high plateaus of Cappadocia that she fell ill. The wind was thin, her breath shorter each night. Marcus was not there. He was in the north, commanding legions. When word reached him, he did not speak. He simply rode day and night until he reached her resting place. But it was too late. She had passed. Some say she died in peace. Others whisper of poison, betrayal, plots. But Marcus believed none of it. He wrote nothing bitter, only grief. He elevated her to divinity, declared her a goddess. Coins bore her image, temples rose in her name. He named an entire city for her, Faustinopolis carved into rock, kissed by wind. It was not just a gesture of power, it was mourning, made permanent. Years later, when Marcus himself felt death's approach, he asked for no grand tomb, no gold, no choir. He only asked to be buried beside her. And he was. Their ashes rest in the mausoleum of Hadrian, close, silent, forgotten by most. But if you stand near and the night is still, you might hear the soft whisper of a Roman emperor calling for the only soul who ever knew his own. Faustina, his wife, his mirror. Gone, but never gone. It began not with ambition, but with sorrow. The Emperor Hadrian, once the most powerful man in the world, was dying. And Rome needed a future. Not just a soldier, not just a noble, but a mind, a soul, a steady flame in a darkening storm. He looked beyond the obvious heirs, beyond the bloodthirsty, and saw Marcus. Only 16, quiet, stoic, still deep in study. But there was something in him, something unshaken. So Hadrian set a chain of adoption in motion. First, he named Antoninus Pius as his heir, calm, wise, balanced, but with one demand, that Antoninus adopt Marcus Aurelius. It was a political knot, a legal labyrinth, but in Rome, adoption could be destiny. Marcus wept in silence when he heard. Not out of joy, but fear. He had never wished for power. He loved books, silence, letters, not swords. And now, destiny would place a crown of iron on his brow. He was moved into the imperial palace, gold walls, marble floors, endless echo. He continued to study, even harder now. Rhetoric, law, philosophy, war. They trained him with generals and scholars alike. Each tutor whispered, "You are the future." But Marcus remained humble, almost reluctant. He wore simple robes, slept on the floor, ate the same meal every day: dried bread, olives, water. He believed indulgence weakened the soul. The Roman court found him strange. But Antoninus Pius saw strength. The boy became a man, then a leader. By age 30, Marcus had sat in on every Senate debate for years. He had judged trials, led armies, and earned the love of the Roman people. But Antoninus, still emperor, refused to step down. He ruled until the day he died, peaceful, gentle in the arms of his family. Then Rome turned and faced Marcus. And Marcus Aurelius, once a quiet child with a book, became the emperor of half the world. Not with cheers, not with thunder, but with silence, with a nod, with a heart heavy with duty. It had begun. The crown did not bring celebration. It brought weight. The very morning Marcus Aurelius became emperor, a second name was added beside his, Lucius Verus. His adopted brother, handsome, loud, wild, a man more drawn to feasts than philosophy. Antoninus had asked for this long ago. 2 rulers, 1 throne. Balance, he believed. Stability. But behind smiles, there were whispers. Many in the Senate doubted Lucius. They saw him as reckless, a shadow to Marcus's son. Still, Marcus shared power equally. He would not let ego tear the empire apart. And then, only months into their rule, came the first blow. Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival, struck. A full invasion. Border towns burned. The eastern provinces begged for aid. Marcus, calm as ever, gave orders. But he did not go. Instead, he sent Lucius. To some, it was a risk. To Marcus, it was trust. Lucius left Rome in golden armor, promising swift victory. But what followed was chaos. Lucius wandered from city to city, indulging himself in drink and dancers. The war dragged on. Only when Rome's veteran generals took over did the tide turn. In time, Parthia was defeated, but at a cost. Thousands dead, provinces in ruin. And worse, the soldiers returned with more than scars. They brought a sickness, a terrible plague. No one knew what it was, but in days it spread like wind. A silent killer. Through cities, villages, villas. Marcus stayed in Rome. He walked the streets himself. He ordered hospitals, rations, prayers. His eyes aged in weeks. But he never looked away. He wrote in his private journal, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." Even as the empire trembled, he stood still. A quiet center in the chaos. Lucius returned to Rome, praised by some, blamed by others. The tension grew, until, in a strange twist of fate, Lucius fell ill. Some say poison, others say the plague. He died quickly, unexpectedly. Marcus mourned him, not just as a co-ruler, but as a brother. And now, the empire had only one ruler. One philosopher, one warrior, one man alone. Marcus Aurelius. Rome had one ruler now. But peace did not follow. The empire, vast and wounded, was unraveling at the edges. To the north, the Marcomanni, fierce Germanic tribes, began to stir. They crossed frozen rivers, attacked Roman forts, burned villages along the Danube. The frontiers groaned under pressure. And so, for the first time, Marcus did something few emperors had. He left the marble halls of Rome and rode to war. He camped with soldiers, ate their food, slept in tents beneath snow-heavy skies. They called him the Philosopher King, but he bled beside them like a soldier. In his small, leather-bound journal, beside flickering lamplight, he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." These words were not for the world. They were for himself. Because the war dragged on, year after year. Each time one tribe was pushed back, another took its place. And then, his worst fear returned. The plague. Still alive, still spreading. Marcus watched as generals fell, scribes coughed blood, young men wasted away. He burned his hands in funeral smoke. He buried friends. He kept writing. And in those pages, he poured his doubts, his fears, his questions to the stars. Not many rulers leave behind armies of marble statues. Marcus left behind thoughts. A book later named Meditations, never meant to be read. Just a whisper to himself. A man trying to stay steady as the world came apart. And yet, amid the sorrow, he endured. He won battles, pushed enemies back, held the empire together like a stitched tapestry. But the weight was growing heavier. He was no longer the quiet boy in Antoninus's villa. He was a tired man, staring at maps lit by candlelight. Still, he would not surrender to chaos. Not yet. Because something waited at the edge of fate. Something that would test his soul more than any sword or sickness. A legacy. A son. And a final war still to come. The wind whispered of war. Long before swords were drawn. Even as Marcus Aurelius studied philosophy beneath olive trees, the outer edges of the Roman world were cracking. To the east, Parthia, ancient and proud. To the north, Germanic tribes, wild and hungry. But Marcus was not raised for battle. He was raised to think, to write, to endure. And so, when war first came to his doorstep, he paused, then walked straight into the fire. The Parthian War was his first true test. A distant land, Persia's legacy full of deserts and ambition. The enemy had taken Armenia, Rome's ally. It was a message, a threat. Marcus sent Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, to lead the campaign. But the true strength behind the victories was the Roman machine. The legions marched. Cities fell. The east burned. Rome won. But it was a bitter victory. Because the legions brought back more than gold and honor. They brought back plague. A terrible sickness. That would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. It spread like smoke across the empire. From soldiers to farmers, priests to children. And Marcus? He didn't run. He stayed in Rome. Organized grain, water, medicine. He wrote letters to governors, generals, healers. He prayed in temples where no gods answered. And still, he never stopped writing in his journals. Do not waste time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. These were not words for glory. They were survival. As Parthia quieted, another shadow rose: the Marcomannic Wars. Germanic tribes, restless and united, surged across the Danube, burning Roman cities, killing governors, shaking the empire's foundations. Marcus led the defense himself. This was no elegant philosopher now. This was a warrior emperor, cold-eyed and tired, but unbroken. He built forts, trained new legions, slept in the mud. He watched the sun rise behind enemy lines, and whispered wisdom to himself as arrows flew. The battles were long. The price was high, but Marcus learned what all great leaders must. Even peace has a cost. The sky over the Danube turned iron gray. The rivers froze. The trees stood like pale skeletons. And Marcus Aurelius remained. The Germanic tribes had united. Marcomanni, Quadi, Sarmatians. Barbarian nations with no cities, no emperors, no gods, but war. They surged like waves against Rome's northern border. And Marcus, the philosopher, became a wall of flesh and will. Winter was cruel. Roman legions froze in their armor. Horses died mid-march. Frostbitten messengers carried news written in blood. But Marcus did not flinch. He built new roads, new forts, new alliances. He promoted brave men regardless of birth. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, his words became iron. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Still, the losses came. He lost generals. He lost thousands of soldiers. He lost sleep. He wrote fewer letters, and more pages in his private journal. And then, in the middle of it all, he lost his beloved wife, Faustina, far away from the battlefield. She died on a distant journey. I kid death. Without him, he could not grieve as a husband. He had to grieve as an emperor. He stood before the men, his voice like stone. I have lost what I loved most, but Rome has not lost me. And so, he stayed. He fought. He walked icy hills as if they were marble halls. He sharpened his mind like a sword, and whispered to himself, "You may break my body, but not my rule." As the second year of war passed, the enemy grew bolder. The Quadi trapped a Roman legion near the river. Surrounded, no escape. And then, as the legend says, a storm came. Thunder cracked. Rampur. Lightning struck the enemy lines. The Romans prayed. The barbarians ran. Some said it was a miracle. Some said it was a lucky storm. Marcus said nothing. He only nodded, and wrote in his journal that night, "All is nature, and nature favors the brave." The third year of war arrived like a shadow, but Marcus Aurelius did not break. He grew colder, calmer, wiser. Each morning he rose before the sun, not in marble baths, but in frost-covered tents. He wrote by oil lamp, He trained beside his men. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice calmed 1,000 fears. The empire watched him. The Senate doubted him, but the soldiers, they followed him like a star in a storm. Victory began in whispers. A minor outpost recaptured. As surprise Red crushed. The Quadi retreated from the forests. The Marcomanni fell into confusion. And for the first time in years, Rome breathed. Marcus did not gloat. He simply exhaled, as if pain was a fog he'd grown used to. But peace, even in victory, was a fragile mask. Far from the battlefield, Rome itself was trembling. A new sickness crept across the empire. Silent, invisible, cruel. It began in the east, carried by returning soldiers. A fever, a cough, a death. Then hundreds, then thousands. The people called it the Antonine Plague, and Marcus could not stop it. He sent physicians. He drained treasuries. He prayed. But the illness took children, took scholas, took senators, even Lucius Phoebus, his co-emperor, his brother-in-law, the only man who shared his burden, was taken by the plague. Marcus stood at the funeral pyre and said, "We are born for cooperation, and now I must walk alone." He did not return to Rome. He could not. He turned back to the front, to the cold, to the fight. And as more tribes gathered at the border, the emperor of Rome, now graying, weary, half-broken, mounted his horse and whispered, "Let them come." By now, Marcus Aurelius was no longer a young emperor. He was a man sculpted by war. Thin, quiet, carved by loss and frost and duty. The world called him Caesar, but he called himself a student of pain. He no longer led from marble halls. He lived in camps, among lice, smoke, and snow. To his soldiers, he was not divine. He was present. He shared their bread, listened to their fears, held the dying in silence. And still, the enemies came. The Quadi, the Sarmatians, the Iazyges. One after another, the tribes descended upon Rome's borders like winter wolves. And Marcus broke them. Not with cruelty, not with rage, but with unshakable calm. He studied their tactics, used spies, waited for rivers to freeze, struck where pride blinded them. The Battle of Carnuntum, the Siege of Aquincum. Victory by victory, he pushed the darkness back. And one night, in the forests of Pannonia, as thunder cracked above, his legion was trapped, surrounded, thirsting. Desperate, Marcus prayed to the gods, and the skies opened, not with death, but with rain. A storm so sudden, so fierce. It scattered the enemy, quenched the Romans, and saved the legion. The soldiers called it the miracle of the rain. And Marcus? He simply looked up, let the water soak his robe, and whispered, "The universe is change, and life is opinion." The empire was wounded, but not dead. As Marcus returned to Rome after years in the wilderness, he found the streets quieter, the senators colder, and the people grateful, but tired. The frontiers may have been safe, but within the marble walls of the capital, another war brewed, one of shadows, of whispers, of rot. Some senators resented the emperor's humility. They whispered, "He dresses like a soldier. He writes too much. He trusts philosophers over generals." But Marcus, he did not answer with force. He answered with wisdom. He gave speeches in the Senate not of power, but of duty. He reduced extravagant games, cut royal expenses, sold palace treasures to feed the hungry. And still, the throne burned. The Antonine Plague returned, a black breath sweeping across the empire. It took merchants, mothers, scholars, legions. Marcus watched his friends die, his wife fall ill. And still he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He did not break. He did not run. He stayed in Rome, walked among the sick, touched their hands, and every night he wrote in silence, not for glory, not for history, but for himself, a quiet man, alone in candlelight, writing thoughts in a leather journal that would one day be known as Meditations. The gods gave Marcus no peace. Just as the plague loosened its grip, news came from the north. The Danube frontier burned again. Tribes once scattered by Roman steel had returned, stronger, fiercer, more united. The Marcomannic Wars had begun, and Marcus, no longer young, no longer spared by illness, gathered his armor once more. He did not send a general. He did not hide behind walls. He mounted his horse, rode into the frost, and became, at last, a true warrior philosopher. From Vindobona to Carnuntum, his armies pushed forward, through ice-covered forests, across blood-soaked rivers. But this was no glorious conquest. It was slow, misérable, endless. Soldiers froze beside campfires. Children were taken hostage. Villages starved. And yet Marcus remained. He slept on the ground beside his men, ate their rations, buried the dead, and wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." Some said he could have ended it all, signed peace, returned home. But Marcus knew, if he turned back now, Rome would never stand again. So he stayed. He fought, and slowly, the tide turned. By the 7th winter, the tribes weakened. Their leaders sued for peace. Rome, bruised and broken, stood tall again. Marcus had won, but not without cost. His body was worn, his soul tired, and his heart forever changed. He no longer saw glory in empire, only responsibility. Victory over the northern tribes brought no peace to Rome. For within the marble halls of power, a kieter war had already begun. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, general, philosopher, had made many enemies, not with the sword, but with silence, with thought, with principle. Senators grumbled, generals whispered, even some in his own family cast long shadows. Because Marcus had a son, Commodus. He was not like his father. Where Marcus sought wisdom, Commodus desired applause. Where Marcus read philosophy, Commodus trained with gladiators. And worse, Marcus, aged and fading, could no longer pretend not to see. The empire he had carried, with calm hands and clear mind, was now in danger of falling into chaos. Not from barbarians, but from bloodlines. Meanwhile, inside the palace, rumors bloomed like rot in the walls. Plots, poison, prophecies. One general, Avidius Cassius, declared Marcus dead, and crowned himself emperor. It was a lie. Marcus was still alive, still writing, still watching. He could have crushed Cassius with fury, but he did not. He paused. He breathed. And then he wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." A ordered no executions, no purges, only peace. Cassius was killed by his own men, and Marcus forgave those who followed him. But the lesson had sunk deep. Even in Rome, even in silence, nothing was safe, not even trust. The boy who once clung to Marcus Aurelius's robes was now a man in the emperor's shadow, and the shadow grew darker with each passing year. Commodus, beloved by the crowds, obsessed with games, drawn not to the scroll but the sword, was not made for ruling. But Marcus, weary with age and illness, watched his only son grow into a figure. He no longer understood. There were moments, rare and flickering, when Marcus would try to teach. They would sit together beneath olive trees, the meditations resting on Marcus's knee. But Commodus would yawn, his eyes drifting to the sound of cheering soldiers, or the glitter of golden armor. He did not want truth. He wanted triumph. And so, the emperor, the philosopher king, faced his greatest failure, not on a battlefield, but in the eyes of his heir. Some urged him to pass the throne to a wiser man, a general, a senator, anyone but his son. But Marcus, he hesitated. He feared civil war, feared the bloodshed that might follow if the boy was denied. He had seen Rome burn before. He would not let it burn again. So, quietly, painfully, he made a choice. Rome would be ruled by Commodus. And with that choice, history shifted. The man who had ruled with logic, who had written to himself in silence, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one, now placed his hopes into hands that crave not virtue, but vanity. Behind the marble pillars, servants spoke in hushed tones. Generals tightened their loyalty. The Senate grew cold with fear. And Marcus? He simply walked the palace halls each evening, slower than before, wondering where he had gone wrong. The winds from the Danube blew colder that year. Snow drifted over the wooden forts, soft and white against the blood-stained earth. And within the Spartan tent of the Roman camp, Marcus Aurelius lay still, not dead, but not far. He coughed often now. His bones ached. And though the war with the Marcomanni raged on beyond the forests, the emperor could no longer ride out with his men. Instead, he wrote, by candlelight, wrapped in thick wool, he filled pages with thoughts for no one but himself. You may leave this life at any moment. Let that determine what you do, say, and think. Commodus had joined him now, not out of duty, but to be seen by the soldiers. He wore bright armor, laughed too loudly, watched the gladiators train as if it were sport, and Marcus, coughing softly in his cot, knew the time had come. He called for his son. In that dim-lit tent, with maps of empire pinned to the walls, the Philosopher King looked into the eyes of the boy who would rule. He spoke not of power, but of burden, not of glory, but of grace. He told Commodus, be firm, but just. Rule not with fear, but with reason. If you must be strong, let it be for Rome, not for yourself. Commodus nodded. But his eyes, they flickered toward the sword resting nearby. And Marcus closed his. The next morning, March 17, 180 AD, the camp was silent. The emperor was gone. No final words, no marble hall, no golden wreath, just the whisper of wind through the Danube trees, and the quiet closing of a chapter. The soldiers wept. The generals saluted. And in Rome, the Senate wore mourning robes of black and purple. But beneath the surface, a fear had begun to grow. Commodus was emperor now, and Rome would never be the same. For a brief moment, Rome exhaled. Though war had stained its borders, the heart of the empire beat strong. Under Marcus Aurelius, the streets of Rome were swept clean, its aqueduct repaired, its temples lit with oil lamps once more. He was not a builder of palaces. He left no gold-domed halls or towering columns in his name. But his reforms, quiet, deliberate, were carved into the soul of the empire. Laws were rebalanced. Slaves were given more rights. Fathers could no longer kill their own sons without trial. Judges were selected for wisdom, not wealth. He opened schools. He preserved Greek philosophy. He made letters, not swords, the legacy of a ruler. And as plagues swept through the cities, he did not retreat to marble villas or mountain air. Marcus stayed, with the people, in the rot and the fear and the ash. When the Tiber overflowed its banks, he walked knee-deep through flooded streets. When the grain ran dry, he gave his own gold to buy food from Egypt. To the poor, he was not an emperor, but a father. And to the Senate, he was not feared, but respected. Even his enemies whispered, "This man rules as though he does not wish to rule at all." In his study surrounded by scrolls, he wrote his meditations quietly. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. And though battles continued far from the capital, Rome itself entered a golden hush. For 10 years, the empire stood not in glory, but in grace. Yet every candle has its wax, every empire its turning season. And while the people slept easy under his reign, the next ruler sharpened his ambitions in silence. Even in daylight, shadows gather at the corners of power. While Marcus Aurelius walked humbly through Rome, his son, Commodus, watched from behind silk curtains, bored of scrolls and bitter at the scent of restraint. Marcus hoped, prayed, that wisdom could be taught like law, that patience could be passed like a crown. But even a philosopher emperor cannot rewrite the nature of blood. Still, Marcus worked. He strengthened the frontiers, sent grain to the provinces, and protected Greece from Gothic raids. He summoned the best minds to his court, Galens and Gaiuses, doctors, mathematicians, architects. He poured wealth into rebuilding cities damaged by war. Temples to Jupiter rose again. Hospitals were built for the common sick. Libraries copied the wisdom of old Athens, scroll by scroll. Every victory was quiet. A child fed, a court reformed, a wall rebuilt. And within his meditations, he wrote not of fame or fortune, but of duty. A man's worth is no greater than the worth of his ambitions. Yet his heart grew heavy. Each time he returned from the northern front, he found Commodus lounging in gladiator's armor, pretending at war. Obsessed with fame, blind to virtue. The Senate saw it. The people whispered, and Marcus, once unshaken, began to doubt. What would become of Rome when he was gone? Would all this careful peace be broken by vanity? Would wisdom fall silent beneath the roar of crowds? He could not delay time. He could not disown his blood. So he prayed, not as Emperor, but as a father. If fate wills, let him surprise us, let him rise. But even Marcus, so often right, could not rewrite fate. The golden age he built was but a breath before the storm. It is said that when a flame knows it is dying, it burns its brightest. The final years of Marcus Aurelius's reign were a soft, golden twilight, filled with purpose and tinged with sorrow. He was no longer the young philosopher of the scrolls, nor the battle-scarred general on the Danube. Now he was a quiet old man, wrapped in wool robes, walking alone through the gardens of the Palatine Hill, his thoughts louder than the fountains. But his empire still glowed with the warmth of his hand. He oversaw one of the last great codifications of Roman law, bringing clarity to the chaos of courts. He expanded citizenship to worthy foreigners. He protected slaves from cruelty. He ensured the poor could appeal to justice, not just the rich. The Senate, once bitter toward emperors, now listened to him with respect. They called him the last of the 5 good emperors. But he never believed in titles. He believed in duty. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. In those days, his eyes looked beyond war, beyond Rome itself. He wanted to leave behind something greater than power. A Rome of reason, of mercy, of quiet strength. And yet, as he looked at Commodus, who now wore golden jewels with childish pride, he feared what would follow. Still, Marcus did not change the line of succession. He would not break tradition. He would not invite civil war. Instead, he wrote his final words into his journals, the meditations that, centuries later, would guide emperors, monks, and modern minds alike. They were not written for the people, not even for Commodus. They were written for himself, a man trying to stay good, in a world always turning. As Rome bathed in the calm of his final reforms, the future waited, with sharpened teeth. But that was not his battle. Not anymore. Marcus Aurelius had walked his path, built his peace, carried his burdens, and now he stood in the last golden light of his empire, ready to rest. Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good. In the final years of his reign, Marcus Aurelius began to feel the slow erosion of both empire and self. The philosopher who once marched with legions now walked slower, his frame burdened not by age alone, but by the weight of sorrow, memory, and unrelenting duty. His beloved wife, Faustina, had passed away. The wars on the Danube dragged endlessly. The plague that once ravaged Rome had returned, weaker but persistent, like a shadow that refused to lift. And though the Senate praised him and statues bore his likeness, Marcus often sat alone with his thoughts, scribbling meditations more frequently, as if trying to make sense of everything one last time. His son Commodus, meant to be his legacy, was a source of unease. Where Marcus was thoughtful, Commodus was impulsive. Where Marcus questioned power, Commodus sought it with hungry eyes. And though Marcus tried gently, patiently to guide his son, he began to fear he had not prepared him well enough. Rome, too, was changing. The empire stretched thin. Corruption seeped through its cracks. Once great generals were now political pawns. The people cried out for bread and spectacle. Marcus watched it all with the quiet ache of someone who had done all he could and feared it was not enough. But he did not despair. He endured. That was always his way. As winter fell upon the empire once more, Marcus felt the cold not just in the air, but in time itself. Despite his failing health, Marcus did not retreat to comfort. Even in old age, he led military campaigns in the north, along the frozen Danube frontier. Wrapped in furs, sleeping among soldiers, he fought not for glory, but for duty. He believed a ruler should never ask of his people what he would not do himself. So he stood with them, through bitter cold and the constant threat of ambush. He watched the breath of his troops rise in the icy air, their loyalty holding the empire's frayed edges together. But inside, Marcus was weakening. Fevers returned. Nights brought coughs and sweats, and as he lay in his tent, surrounded by maps and letters, he began to accept that his time was drawing to a close. In quiet moments, he thought of Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father, and wondered if he had honored his memory. He thought of Faustina, and whether they would meet again. He He thought of Rome, not the city, but the idea of it. Noble, flawed, eternal. He summoned Commodus to his side, knowing this would be their last conversation. In that tent, among armor and parchment, he tried once more to pass on not just an empire, but a philosophy. Live humbly, rule wisely, fear not death. Whether those words took root, only time would tell. Marcus Aurelius died in Vindobona, present-day Vienna, in 180 AD. No crowds, no triumph, just a tent in the cold, and a final breath that left behind a world forever changed. The soldiers mourned him. Even the Senate, long weary of emperors, wept. For Rome had lost more than a ruler. It had lost its last philosopher king. Commodus took the throne young, ambitious, and ready to rule. But the empire he inherited would soon tilt toward decline. Historians would look back and mark Marcus's death as the end of Rome's golden age. And yet, Marcus himself might have seen it differently. He would not have sought marble tombs or eternal praise. He would have hoped, perhaps, that someone, somewhere, might read his words, might choose wisdom over wrath, might try simply to be good. His ashes were returned to Rome and placed in Hadrian's mausoleum. But his truest resting place was always in thought. Wherever someone struggles, endures, reflects there, Marcus lives on. When Commodus ascended the throne in 180 AD, the air in Rome shifted. He was the son of a philosopher, raised under the shadow of wisdom and discipline. But the man who took the imperial seat bore little resemblance to the father who had molded him. Gone were the cold nights in the field, the reflective journals, the moral weight of rule. Commodus entered Rome not as a servant of the state, but as its master. At first, the people rejoiced. He brought games, he reduced taxes, he spoke to the masses with charm. Statues were erected, coins bore his image. The Senate gave him titles. But behind the scenes, Marcus's advisors watched with tightening jaws. They saw the recklessness in his decisions, the cruelty behind the smile. Commodus had no taste for governance. He delegated power to sycophants and favorites. He distrusted the Senate, avoided the duties of state, and sought personal glory not in policy, but in the arena. Rome had a new emperor, but something old had died with Marcus: restraint. As the golden years faded behind him, Commodus began to drift into delusion. He no longer wished to be a ruler, wished to be a legend. He declared himself Hercules reborn, donning lionskins and wielding a massive club carved from oak. He stalked through the palace barefoot, muscles oiled, eyes wide with theatrical pride. He renamed Rome itself. He called it Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The Senate, terrified, accepted it with forced applause. Every month was renamed in his honor. The calendar became a monument to his ego. Then came the games. Commodus appeared in the Colosseum not as a guest, but as a gladiator. He fought animals drugged into sleep. He slayed disabled men dressed as foes. Thousands gathered to cheer, but their joy was thin like the sheen on tarnished gold. He charged Rome 1,000,000 sesterces for each appearance. The empire bled coins, while the emperor basked in praise bought with fear. Those who resisted vanished. He murdered senators on whispers. He executed his sister's husband. He struck down generals, philosophers, former tutors, anyone who reminded him of his father's restraint. Where Marcus had reflected, Commodus indulged. Where Marcus had sacrificed, Commodus demanded. Even the statues of Marcus Aurelius were toppled. His name was scratched from stone. The voice of philosophy was silenced beneath roars and applause. Commodus had erased the memory of the man who raised him. And yet, in the quiet corners of Rome, in libraries, temples, and gardens, people still whispered of Marcus. His name, though unwelcome, would not die. And that quiet resistance only deepened Commodus's madness. He saw ghosts in every hall, daggers in every hand, and in the mirror, a god staring back. Commodus ruled for 12 turbulent years. By the end, Rome barely recognized itself. Assassinations, purges, and theatrical displays marked his final months. He declared himself the new Romulus, renamed Rome after himself, and planned to appear in public as a god reborn. But within the palace walls, silence was brewing. His inner circle, once loyal, had turned fearful. On New Year's Eve, 192 AD, his concubine Marcia discovered a list of names scheduled for execution, her name included. In desperation, she conspired with trusted allies. Poison was prepared. When the poison failed to kill him, they sent in a wrestler, a man who had once trained with Commodus, to strangle the emperor in his bath. And just like that, the self-made god of Rome was no more. News of his death spread cautiously. The Senate rejoiced. Statues were torn down. The empire entered a brief civil war, the year of the 5 emperors. But amidst the chaos, a whisper lingered. Marcus Aurelius had ruled with virtue. Commodus had ruled with vanity. And Rome, ever restless, moved on.